It's about that time. Time to work on the BMW again. Previously, when I was under the car checking things out, I noticed the driveshaft coupling looked a little worse for wear. So I made a mental note to replace it sometime soon. Since I just removed the differential to work on it, this is a great time to replace that driveshaft coupling. So let's do that. To get at the driveshaft, the exhaust and one of the heat shields needs to come out. Also, these two reinforcement plates in the middle of the car need to come out. One of those plates also supports the exhaust. Next, I'm going to loosen the nuts that attach the exhaust system to the manifolds. Since I live in Florida, they weren't very rusty. A little bit of penetrating oil did the trick. I didn't completely remove the nuts, I just loosened them a few turns. The idea was to let the exhaust drop down without completely removing it. But later on, I changed my mind about that. I got tired of working around the exhaust and removed it completely. Anyway, there are two more exhaust hangers that need to be removed. They're on either side of the muffler. Each hanger has two nuts. Keep in mind, when you're removing that last hanger, it's the only thing holding up the exhaust system at this point. So if you're not careful, you might get a muffler to the face. And here we have the exhaust hanging on the ground. I forgot to mention, my car has a flap in the muffler. It used to have a vacuum hose attached to the actuator for that flap, but I deleted it because the flap doesn't work anyway. If you're doing this job, you'll want to disconnect that vacuum line before you drop the exhaust. Okay, now we need to remove the one heat shield. We need to remove that big one that goes down the middle of the car. It has a bunch of 10mm screws holding it up. With that heat shield out of the way, we now have access to the drive shaft. First, I'm going to disconnect the drive shaft from the differential. These bolts use an E12 socket. I applied the parking brake to keep the wheels from turning while I removed the bolts. I couldn't get all of them at once, so I removed 3 of them, then I turned the drive shaft 180 degrees and got the other 3. To detach the drive shaft from the differential, you might need to loosen the adjusting collar on the drive shaft, so you can shorten it a bit. That adjusting collar is right in front of the center support bearing. I didn't need to do that because I removed the differential. Next, I'm going to remove the bolts that attach the drive shaft to the transmission. These bolts are really tight, and they have a nut on the other side. So I put a spanner on the nut, put the transmission in neutral, and let the drive shaft turn until the spanner was wedged against the car. Then I loosened the bolt with a breaker bar. I loosened all 6 of the bolts this way, but if you want to, you can loosen just the 3 that attach the coupling to the transmission and deal with the other 3 later, whichever you prefer. The drive shaft is almost ready to come out. We just need to detach the center support. It has 2 nuts. It also has some black goop on the top between the center support and the floor pan. So the drive shaft didn't just fall out, I had to work it loose. I put a floor jack under the drive shaft just in case, but I didn't really need it. Okay, the drive shaft is out and the coupling is removed. Here's what the old coupling looked like. I could almost fold it in half by hand, and you can see it has a lot of cracks. So yeah, it needs to be replaced. If you look at the coupling, you'll see some arrows around the outside edge. Each of those arrows needs to point to a metal flange. So 3 of the arrows will point to the drive shaft flange. The other 3 will point to the transmission flange. This is important to make sure it's installed correctly. If you don't do this, the coupling won't last very long. I decided to bolt the coupling to the drive shaft first, then install the drive shaft. The bolts were originally installed so all the nuts were facing the front of the car. BMW probably did that to make it easier to assemble the car. But standard practice is to have the nuts on the flange side. So I decided to go with convention. So I installed these bolts with the nuts facing the drive shaft. I just installed the bolts hand tight, but in retrospect it might have been easier to torque them before installing the drive shaft. Just keep in mind you need to hold the bolt steady and turn the nut. If the bolt turns, it might twist the rubber in the coupling, and that could damage it. Anyway, let's get this drive shaft installed. Like I mentioned before, the center support bearing has some black goop on top. In my case, there was still plenty of goop, and it was still goopy, so I decided not to replace it. Before lifting the drive shaft in place, I put a jack stand under the rear section. I didn't want that flopping around while I was fitting the drive shaft into the transmission. The drive shaft needs to be fairly level in order to fit into the transmission. If you try to install it at an angle, it might damage the sleeve in the drive shaft. Just FYI. With the front of the drive shaft in place, the next step would be to fit the rear of the drive shaft into the differential. But I couldn't do that because the differential is still out of the car. So I'll just put this photo here and we'll pretend I'm attaching the drive shaft to the differential. We'll just install the bolts hand tight and torque them later. Now we need to fit the center support bearing into the chassis. Slide it into place, then push the bearing assembly forward. According to the service manual, the housing for the center support bearing needs to be pushed forward about 4 to 6 millimeters to preload it. Then we torque the nuts to 15 foot-pounds. Next, we'll torque the drive shaft differential bolts. Now comes the fun part, torquing the drive shaft to transmission bolts. Like I mentioned earlier, we need to be careful not to turn the bolts because that could damage the rubber. So we need to hold the bolt with a spanner and tighten the nut with the torque wrench. The 3 bolts that attach the coupling to the drive shaft weren't too bad. I snuck a spanner in behind the transmission mount and turned the drive shaft until the spanner was wedged against the chassis. Then I torqued the nut. The other 3 bolts were more of a challenge. I couldn't get the torque wrench behind the transmission mount, and I didn't want to remove it. So I put the torque wrench on the bolt head and used the spanner to tighten the nut until the torque wrench clicked. I don't have any footage of that because I couldn't operate the camera while doing this. But try to imagine me lying under the car with the torque wrench propped up against my armpit while I struggle to turn the spanner with both hands. Fun stuff. If you loosened that adjusting collar to shorten the drive shaft, now would be the time to retighten it. Anyway, the drive shaft is now installed. The next steps would be to reinstall the heat shield and the exhaust. But I'm not going to do that yet because I'm still working on the differential. Speaking of which, hopefully that will be done soon. Right now I'm waiting on parts. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching.